Welcome to the Discourse Analyzer AI Toolkit, where articles come alive. You're listening to the audio version of our article. For the full text and an interactive experience, check out the link in the description below. Interact with any selection using our AI assistant to enhance your understanding. Let's explore.
Marginalized Voices in Discourse Analysis. Interactive Assistant. Marginalized voices refer to individuals or groups who are systematically excluded, silenced, or underrepresented in public discourse due to social, economic, political, or cultural factors. In discourse analysis, marginalized voices are examined to understand how language reflects and reinforces power relations, how certain voices are silenced or marginalized, and how language can be a tool for empowerment or resistance. The analysis of marginalized voices seeks to uncover who is allowed to speak, whose perspectives dominate discourse, and how certain narratives are constructed to maintain inequality or exclusion. Discourse analysis of marginalized voices looks at how language constructs the identities of marginalized groups, the power dynamics that influence whose voices are heard, and how marginalized groups use language to resist oppression or challenge dominant narratives. This type of analysis is particularly relevant in understanding how media, politics, education, and other institutions either reinforce or challenge social hierarchies. Key features of marginalized voices in discourse analysis. 1. Silencing and exclusion. Marginalized voices are often silenced or excluded from mainstream discourse, either through overt censorship or more subtle means such as tokenism, invisibility, or dismissal. Discourse analysis investigates how language choices, institutional policies, and power dynamics contribute to the exclusion of certain groups from public conversations. Example: in media coverage of political issues, indigenous perspectives might be ignored or marginalized, with news reports focusing only on government or corporate voices. Discourse analysis would explore how this exclusion occurs and how it reflects broader societal power imbalances, where certain groups are systematically silenced. 2. Tokenism and surface-level representation. Sometimes, marginalized voices are superficially included in public discourse through tokenism, where their inclusion is symbolic rather than substantive. Discourse analysis examines how this performative inclusion works to maintain the status quo while giving the appearance of diversity. Example: in a corporate diversity campaign, companies might highlight a few minority employees in marketing materials without addressing underlying issues of discrimination or inequality in the workplace. Discourse analysis would examine how this surface-level inclusion fails to engage with the real challenges facing marginalized groups. 3. Resistance and empowerment. Marginalized voices also engage in resistance through discourse, using language to challenge dominant narratives, reclaim agency, and assert their identities. Discourse analysis explores how marginalized groups use language to resist exclusion and advocate for social change. Example: in social movements like Black Lives Matter, marginalized communities use slogans like, "Say her name," to draw attention to the violence faced by Black women, highlighting voices that are often ignored in mainstream discussions of police brutality. Discourse analysis would investigate how this language challenges dominant narratives of invisibility and asserts the need for visibility and justice. 4. Reclaiming identity through language. Language can be a powerful tool for reclaiming identity for marginalized groups. Discourse analysis looks at how marginalized voices reclaim terms or narratives that have historically been used to oppress them, turning those narratives into tools for empowerment. Example: the LGBTQ+ community has reclaimed the term queer, once used as a slur, to create a sense of identity and solidarity. Discourse analysis would explore how the reclaiming of language functions as an act of empowerment, transforming harmful language into a source of pride and resistance. 5. Intersectionality and multiple marginalizations. Marginalized voices often experience intersectionality, where multiple aspects of identity, e.g., race, gender, class, sexuality, intersect to create unique experiences of oppression. Discourse analysis examines how intersectionality is represented, or ignored, in public discourse and how marginalized voices navigate these intersecting identities. Example: in discussions of feminism, women of color may be marginalized if the conversation focuses primarily on the experiences of white women. Discourse analysis would explore how intersectional identities are either represented or excluded, and how women of color use language to advocate for an intersectional approach to gender equality. 6. Gatekeeping and access to platforms. Gatekeeping refers to the control over who has access to platforms where discourse takes place, such as media outlets, political forums, or academic institutions. Discourse analysis investigates how gatekeeping practices limit the participation of marginalized voices and how those voices find alternative platforms to be heard. Example: in the publishing industry, authors from marginalized backgrounds might struggle to get their work published or receive less visibility compared to more privileged voices. Discourse analysis would examine how these gatekeeping practices shape which stories are told and whose voices are given legitimacy in public discourse. 7. Visibility and representation in digital platforms. Digital platforms provide spaces where marginalized voices can gain visibility and representation outside of traditional gatekeeping structures. Discourse analysis examines how digital platforms like social media enable marginalized voices to challenge dominant narratives, form communities, and advocate for change. Example: on Twitter, hashtags like #DisabilityPride create spaces where disabled individuals can share their experiences, advocate for accessibility, and challenge ableist narratives. Discourse analysis would explore how marginalized voices use these platforms to gain visibility and challenge stereotypes. Methods for analyzing marginalized voices in discourse. 1. Critical discourse analysis, CDA. Critical discourse analysis, CDA, examines how marginalized voices are either excluded or represented in public discourse, focusing on the power relations that shape who gets to speak and how. CDA investigates how dominant groups maintain power through discourse and how marginalized groups challenge these structures. Example: a CDA of media coverage on immigration might analyze how migrants are framed as either victims or criminals, and how the voices of migrants themselves are often excluded or tokenized in these discussions. The analysis would explore how this framing reinforces dominant narratives about migration and marginalizes the voices of those directly affected. 2. Frame analysis. Frame analysis looks at how issues involving marginalized groups are framed in public discourse, focusing on what aspects are highlighted and what perspectives are downplayed or ignored. This method is useful for examining how language shapes public understanding of marginalized communities. Example: in discussions about homelessness, media coverage might frame the issue as one of public safety or community disruption, rather than focusing on the experiences of homeless individuals. Frame analysis would explore how this framing marginalizes the voices of the homeless by prioritizing concerns of the housed population. 3. Narrative analysis. Narrative analysis focuses on the stories told about marginalized groups and how these stories either reinforce or challenge dominant narratives. This method examines the structure of these stories, the characters involved, and how power relations are reflected in the telling of these stories. Example: in the context of indigenous land rights, mainstream narratives might focus on economic development, sidelining indigenous voices advocating for environmental preservation and cultural heritage. Narrative analysis would examine how indigenous stories about land are constructed and how these narratives challenge the dominant discourse on land use. 4. Corpus analysis. Corpus analysis involves analyzing large collections of text to identify patterns in how marginalized groups are discussed. This method helps to uncover recurring themes, stereotypes, or exclusions across a wide range of texts. Example: a corpus analysis of news articles about refugees might reveal how terms like crisis or burden are frequently used, while the personal stories of refugees are underrepresented. The analysis would explore how language patterns reinforce negative stereotypes and marginalize refugee voices in public discourse. Examples of marginalized voices in discourse analysis. Example 1. Media coverage of Black Lives Matter. In media coverage of the Black Lives Matter (BLM) movement, Mainstream outlets may focus on the actions of protesters or law enforcement, rather than the voices of Black communities affected by police violence. Discourse analysis would explore how these voices are marginalized in favor of dominant narratives about public safety or law and order, and how BLM uses slogans like, "No justice, no peace," to reclaim space in the conversation. Example 2. Gender equality and the representation of women in politics. In political discourse, women's voices are often marginalized or treated as secondary to male voices, especially in male-dominated fields like politics. Discourse analysis would investigate how female politicians are framed differently from their male counterparts, often focusing on their appearance or demeanor rather than their policies. This marginalization reflects broader gender inequalities in political representation. Example 3. Indigenous voices in environmental discourse. Indigenous communities are often marginalized in discussions about environmental policy, with governments or corporations framing land use in terms of economic development. Discourse analysis would explore how Indigenous groups use language to assert their rights and challenge the framing of land as a resource to be exploited, promoting narratives about sustainability and stewardship instead. Example 4. LGBTQ+ voices in public health discourse. During the early days of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, LGBTQ+ voices were marginalized in public health discourse, with the media and government framing the crisis as a gay disease. Discourse analysis would examine how this language contributed to stigma and exclusion and how LGBTQ+ activists used counter-narratives to challenge the dominant discourse, advocating for visibility, funding, and support. Example 5. Disability advocacy on social media. On platforms like Twitter, hashtags such as #CripTheVote create spaces where disabled individuals advocate for political representation and accessibility in policymaking. Discourse analysis would explore how these voices challenge the traditional exclusion of disabled people from political discourse and how digital platforms enable marginalized groups to assert their agency and visibility. Challenges in analyzing marginalized voices through discourse. 1. Lack of representation. Marginalized groups are often underrepresented in public discourse, making it difficult to capture their voices. Discourse analysts must work to find alternative platforms, such as social media or community-based media, where these voices are more likely to be expressed. 2. Co-optation and dilution. When marginalized voices are included, they can sometimes be co-opted or diluted by dominant groups, losing their original message or intent. Discourse analysts must carefully analyze how inclusion may serve to reinforce existing power dynamics rather than challenge them. 3. Intersectionality and complexity. Marginalized voices often face multiple and intersecting forms of oppression, making their experiences complex and difficult to categorize. Discourse analysts must consider the intersectionality of race, gender, class, sexuality, and other identities when analyzing how marginalized voices are expressed or silenced. Conclusion. Marginalized voices are central to understanding the power dynamics that shape public discourse. Through discourse analysis, researchers can uncover how certain groups are excluded, silenced, or tokenized, and how marginalized communities use language to resist oppression, reclaim identity, and advocate for social change. By examining framing, narrative structures, gatekeeping, and intersectionality, discourse analysis reveals the complex ways in which language reflects societal inequalities and how marginalized voices challenge or navigate these dynamics. Understanding the role of marginalized voices in discourse is essential for fostering more inclusive, equitable communication in society. Frequently asked questions. What are marginalized voices in discourse analysis? Marginalized voices refer to individuals or groups that are excluded, underrepresented, or silenced in public discourse due to social, economic, political, or cultural factors. In discourse analysis, these voices are studied to understand power relations and how language can either reinforce or challenge inequality. How does discourse analysis help identify marginalized voices? Discourse analysis examines who is allowed to speak, how certain groups are represented or excluded, and the power dynamics at play. It focuses on language choices in media, politics, education, and other settings to reveal systemic silencing or superficial inclusion, e.g., tokenism. What is tokenism in the context of marginalized voices? Tokenism refers to the symbolic inclusion of marginalized voices without real engagement or change. Discourse analysis investigates how this performative practice maintains the status quo while presenting an illusion of diversity. How do marginalized groups use language for resistance? Marginalized groups often use language to challenge dominant narratives, reclaim identities, and assert agency. Discourse analysis studies how slogans, counter-narratives, and grassroots communication are used in movements to promote visibility and advocate for social justice, e.g., Say Her Name, in Black Lives Matter. What role does intersectionality play in discourse analysis of marginalized voices? Intersectionality examines how multiple aspects of identity, e.g., race, gender, class, combine to create unique experiences of marginalization. Discourse analysis considers these overlapping identities to understand how language includes or excludes complex, multifaceted voices. What is gatekeeping in public discourse? Gatekeeping refers to control over who has access to platforms where discourse happens, such as media outlets or political forums. Discourse analysis looks at how these practices limit participation by marginalized voices and how alternative platforms are used to circumvent exclusion. How do digital platforms impact the representation of marginalized voices? Digital platforms can provide new spaces for marginalized groups to share experiences, challenge dominant narratives, and form supportive communities. Discourse analysis examines how online hashtags, blogs, and forums amplify these voices and how they navigate the power dynamics of digital spaces. What are examples of marginalized voices in media coverage? Media may marginalize voices by focusing on dominant perspectives, such as only highlighting government officials in discussions of indigenous land rights. Discourse analysis would explore how this practice excludes indigenous perspectives and maintains existing power structures. How do marginalized groups reclaim language for empowerment? Reclaiming language involves turning terms historically used to oppress into sources of pride and identity. For instance, the LGBTQ+ community has reclaimed the term queer. Discourse analysis looks at how this linguistic shift challenges power and fosters solidarity. What challenges exist in analyzing marginalized voices? Challenges include underrepresentation, co-optation of marginalized voices, and accounting for the complexity of intersectional experiences. Analysts must navigate these issues to accurately represent and analyze the discourse involving marginalized voices.